So I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it already, to check out that exhibit one floor down in this library, or he is visiting assistant professor of history at Florida International University. Dr. Royles is a historian of the United States.
Slide, please. So here, as elsewhere in the South, the rest of the HIV and AIDS today are gay and bisexual men and African Americans and African U.S. population, but about 44% of new HIV infections in the country. So we're talking about 4 to 1 over 4 times, or I guess that would be 3 times, but a very disproportionate impact of HIV and AIDS on Black communities. And so the people who are living, Black men, are some of the most affected by this disease. So you can see on the bar graph behind me, the clinical term that we use to designate gay men, bisexual men, and men who have sexual relationships with others. But you can see that in overall numbers, for white men who have sex with men and Black men who have sex with men, the Americans make up only about 13% of the total population, and I think white Americans today, but again, a very disproportionate impact. And so researchers estimate that a Black gay man will be by age 25. And by the time that a Black gay man hits age 40, that likelihood Black gay and bisexual men, Black women have also been particularly hard hit by HIV and AIDS, that HIV of white women. And among women, transgender women have been affected by HIV to an HIV risk for transgender women is 49 times that of adults as a whole. List these statistics, which frankly are horrifying, to sensationalize the outcome. But when we talk about the statistics, it's easy to do so in a way that I think makes the stigma overall problem. So I hope these statistics are shocking, but I hope that they're shocking not for what, but I hope that they're shocking for what they reveal about our society as a whole. It really flows along the contours of prejudice and stigma and inequality, sexism, poverty, homophobia, transphobia, all of these social factors in AIDS. So it should really come as no surprise then that the AIDS epidemic is worst in places of wealth and poverty and in places that have rejected the kinds of social welfare programs that those programs often precisely because they are seen as helping people of color. So of these 8 southern states on this list, 7 have rejected Medicaid expansion, but only because Governor John Bel Edwards, 5 months ago, right after taking office, signed an executive order. I mean, along those lines, it should also come as no surprise that gay men and transgender women, when 32 states still do not provide full non-discrimination protections in employment, proportionately from HIV and AIDS, when Black college graduates overall, so again, this is a disease that really follows the contours of inequality and of prejudice and of stigma. Driving makes clear, AIDS activists have, for a very long time, recognized that it's these different epidemics. And so today I'm going to talk about AIDS activism. And specifically, I'm going to talk about AIDS activism, about the ways that AIDS activists in the 1980s and the 1990s used different forms of memory to remember the loved ones that they had lost and to confront the stigma surrounding this disease. Activism today, looking specifically at an example from the past year, at the controversy surrounding the American art scene. And so, whereas we'll begin by talking about the ways that activists used memory, we'll see how more recently the memory of the AIDS epidemic has itself become politicized. And then finally, informs the directions that AIDS activism might take in the future, and where we might collectively go as well. So going back to the early years of the AIDS crisis in the United States, I think in years, doctors actually reported the disease, first reported the disease that would become known as AIDS almost 81. By the end of 1984, the year that scientists identified HIV, it had been identified in the United States, and about 5,600 people had died. By the end of the first public address on AIDS, over 50,000 cases had been reported. In 1990, the year that Congress passed the Ryan White Care Act, the first big AIDS funding bill, and the cases had been reported in the United States, and over 120,000 had died. was not, of course, evenly distributed throughout the country. It was concentrated in particular communities. And it's really not uncommon to hear gay men who lived through the first decades of the AIDS crisis talk about going to dozens of their friends. Slide. Vito Russo, a queer film scholar, described this devastation and what it was like to live through it in a 1988 speech. This one.
In this country is like living in the Twilight Zone. Living with AIDS is like living through a war which is happening only till it explodes. You look around and you discover that you've lost more of your friends. But nobody else notices. It's as though we were living through some sort of nightmare. And only you can hear the screams of the people who are dying. And it's worse than...
So just a sense of what that experience was like with that. During those early years of the crisis, activists politicized the memory of those they had lost. This sense of erasure of the epidemic's invisibility for those who weren't directly affected by it. Realized friends and lovers must have seemed like a preemptive effort to make sure that they themselves were not themselves HIV positive, and many AIDS activists in the early years were. The shadow of death hung over enduring efforts to memorialize those lost to AIDS came in the form of the AIDS quilt. Like San Francisco AIDS and gay rights activist Cleve Jones asked marchers that died of AIDS. And at the end of the march, they taped all the signs to the outside of the Federal. The signs looked like a quilt, and the idea for the AIDS Memorial Quilt was born. More than 48,000 panels representing over 94,000 individuals engraved. So that each of these panels is meant to be an expression of laying out the... Today, altogether, the quilt weighs 54 tons, and new panels are being added all the time. It's so 1996, and it's perhaps the best metaphor for the incomprehensible enormity. One more. Go back. Go back one more. That there. So this is the quilt being displayed in 1992 on the National Mall and covered the equivalent of over 24 football fields. So displaying the quilt as this expression of a very significant, nationally fraught public space, laying it at the feet of Congress for the failure for, as Surviving and Thriving says, the federal inaction on the AIDS epidemic. Really affected by AIDS, so gay men, people of color, the poor, drug users, at the time were a federal response. And gay men in particular were seen as being anathema, contrary. The memorial quilt, by appropriating this form of American folk art, this piece of Americana, federal inaction on AIDS. By using the quilt to memorialize people who had died, these activists took this American tradition and made it perfectly queer. But just in the words used to remember a friend in the pages of a newspaper or at their funeral. So, Assata Hussein, pictured here, a Haitian-born performance artist in the late 1980s and early 1990s, was one of these memorializers. And he would write gay writers that foregrounded, that made clear their sexuality and the fact that and these obituaries that Saint wrote differed markedly from those that were published, say, in mainstream newspapers, either the person's sexuality or the fact that they had died of complications from AIDS. In 1989, the Times referred only euphemistically to a long illness as the cause of death. And compare this to Saint's page-long obituary for David Frechette, a fellow member of the Black, in a newsletter for people with AIDS in 1988. Good slide. Food. Remember his own glorious pecan pies, meatloafs or quiches, good films, good theater, that accompanied the tales of the escapades. The Good Life. As he wrote in the poem, Non, je n'en grave on my tombstone, here sleeps a happy black faggot, who lived to love and died with no guilt. At his funeral, and performed at the funeral of his friend and ACT UP member, Ortez Alderson, a black gay writer and the executive director of an organization called AIDS Films, which was an AIDS education service. Wood's family had excised any mention of either his sexuality or the fact that he had died. Saint stood up during the middle of the service and loudly demanded that they not strip these parts of. So, moving back to larger public displays, AIDS activist group in the history of the epidemic, at least in this country, also turned this traditionally private. So since the early 1990s, active chapters have used political funerals, a form of protest actually, to put direct pressure on lawmakers and on government agencies to investigate, to include infections that specifically affected women, so that those women could have access to housing benefits and disease. And at the same time, out into the open, they fought against the erasure of queer people and people with AIDS from public memory. It's like most heart-wrenching protests, the Ashes Action from 1992. People who had lost loved ones to AIDS brought the literal ashes, the literal remains of their lovers, sons, daughters, brothers, fathers, mothers, and friends to throw over the fence at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, spreading them over the White House lawn. And before the action, they took turns eulogizing their loved ones through a megaphone, giving witness to their loss before delivering evidence of government neglect in the face of this crisis to one of the leaders they held most responsible for the suffering. Go to Chrome. This is the second tab. So this is going to be a clip from the Ashes Action introduced by David Robinson, who is a veteran ACTA member. And you'll see both the delivering of the ashes, but also some of the eulogizing that took place beforehand.
A lot of us agreed that we wanted to show the truth of the unvarnished truth. Don't pretty this up in any way. What has come out of this epidemic? It's ashes, it's bone chips.
many ways typical of the political funerals that ACT UP has used since the 1990s to show in public the human cost of AIDS. Good slide. So these include the political funeral for artist and AIDS activist David Wojnarowicz, slide, and for AIDS activist Mark Lowe Fisher. And more recently, ACT UP Philadelphia, which is one of the longest lasting and most active chapters in the country, has used political funerals as well as empty caskets as symbols in their protest against cuts to public aid services in Pennsylvania. And you can see that in one of the panels in Surviving and Thriving. But more recently, activists have focused attention on the ways that the AIDS epidemic is remembered and represented. So last October, the Tacoma Art Museum in Washington State mounted an exhibit called Art AIDS America, a major exhibition of works by over 100 artists exploring the impact of the AIDS epidemic on the American art world. And this epidemic included panels from the AIDS Memorial Quilt, as well as work by ACT UP, such as the 1987 installation, Let the Record Show, originally mounted at the New Museum in New York and here recreated, or I think this is the original, recreated, however, at the Tacoma Art Museum, as well as photographs of some of those political funerals, such as this one from the political funeral that ACT UP held for AIDS activist John Greenberg. So Art AIDS America also featured work by some of the visual artists who grappled with, on the one hand, the devastation that they witnessed all around them, at the same time that they were coming to terms with their own declining health. So here we have work by David Wojnarowicz, maybe one of the most iconic images from the AIDS epidemic used by U2, I think on the cover for the single release of Song 1. But here, David Wojnarowicz, taking this image of the eradication of the American buffalo in the late 19th century as a metaphor for the just widespread death and devastation that he experienced in his own social world. Slide. And then we also have work by Keith Haring in this exhibit, such as this one entitled Altarpiece. And Keith Haring is another one of probably the most iconic visual artists associated with AIDS and AIDS activism. And he's the one who drew the poster that's actually featured on the flyer for Surviving and Thriving. So two visual artists very closely associated with the epidemic and with AIDS activism. Other work in the exhibition evokes the sense of loss or of absence. Such as Bill Jacobson's interim portrait, which, this face that appears to be disappearing before the viewer's eyes, or Shimon Atti's Untitled Memory. It's like a projection of a departed lover in the space that the artist shared with him. Other work is more recent, and this includes AIDS activist Joey Turtle's Still Life with Forget-Me-Nots and 1 week's dose of Truvada. Truvada is an antiretroviral drug, one of those that has really since the mid-90s changed the meaning of HIV positivity, made it from a death sentence into a more or less chronic and manageable illness, at least for people who have access to medication. That's an important distinction to make, but here Terrell is taking Truvada, this drug that has been so significant in the history of HIV and AIDS, and incorporated it into this pretty unsettling pop art still life, and one that, interestingly, is kind of haunted in a way by David Wojnarowicz, whose work is quoted in the upper left-hand corner. It's a picture of Wojnarowicz as a child, surrounded by a bunch of text reflecting on the homophobia that Wojnarowicz grew up with. Slide. Another more recent work, Robert Scherer's Sweet Williams, is not a piece that appears to speak to issues surrounding HIV and AIDS at all, until you learn that it's painted with HIV-positive blood. As well as that the name and the concept for the piece comes from a story from Cher's childhood. And that is when he would pick flowers with his grandmother, she told him to cut the pretty ones first. And that story reminded him what it was like to watch young friends cut down in the prime of their lives in the early years of the crisis. Slide. One more recent work is Kia and Mommy by the visual artist, performance artist Kia LaBeija, who is the sole artist in the exhibit, or in the exhibition, who contracted HIV through mother-to-child transmission. Her mother was HIV positive, her mother was a victim of rape and incest, and her mother died when she was very young. So her work is a memorial, but is also autobiographical in a way that some of the other work in the exhibition is not. So the organizers of Art AIDS America set out to show that AIDS left this indelible mark on the landscape of American art, and they put together this exhibition that is breathtaking and arresting. But even so, this is an exhibit that has drawn its share of criticism. So you might remember the battles over obscenity in American art that raged during the culture wars of the late 80s, the 1990s. You might even remember the controversy surrounding Vajnarovich's A Fire in My Belly, a video work, slide here, a video work that was featured in 2010 in the National Portrait Gallery's exhibition Hide-Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture, but was removed under criticism from House Speaker John Boehner and the Catholic League for its depiction of a crucifix covered in ants. This is an 11-second clip out of a 4-minute video work. However, all that being said, the most sustained criticism of Art AIDS America has not been for what is contained in the exhibition, but rather for what was left out. Because in spite of the disproportionate impact of HIV and AIDS on people of color in the United States, and on African Americans in particular, the roster of artists represented in Art AIDS America was made up primarily of white men. Out of 107 artists represented in the original show, only 4 are black, and Kia LaBeija is the only black woman. So in response, last December, members of the activist group Tacoma Action Collective staged a die-in at the Tacoma Art Museum to protest the exhibit. Slide. For these activists, the absence of black artists from the exhibit perpetuate the invisibility of black people, and particularly of black women, in the American AIDS epidemic, which has disproportionately, very disproportionately, affected them. So hence they organized and publicized their protest with the hashtags Stop Erasing Black People and Die-In at TAM. And the particular tactic that they chose for this action, which is the die-in, is one that in a very interesting way calls our attention to continuities between an older generation of AIDS activists and the current generation of Black Lives Matter activists. The die-in is a tactic that was used by AIDS activists going back to ACTIV's first demonstration in March 1987, a demonstration, a die-in at Wall Street to protest the high price of AZT, which at the time was the only drug approved by the FDA to treat AIDS, and one that in 1987 dollars cost $10,000 a year to acquire. So the die-in as a tactic, called back to the sit-ins of the civil rights movement, but also stressed the gravity, the seriousness of AIDS in America. And through this tactic, AIDS activists have argued that the result of high drug prices, of federal inaction, would be more death. And as yet another form of public mourning, the die-in is meant to dramatize and publicize, and especially for those not directly affected by AIDS, the toll in human lives that the epidemic has taken. Then more recently, the die-in has been revived by Black Lives Matter, again to dramatize and publicize the deadly effects here of mass incarceration and of police violence, especially for those, particularly in white America, who often do not witness these phenomena firsthand. And while Stop Erasing Black People and Diane and Tam were not specifically about those issues of state violence, they reflect a theme that has run through AIDS activism in communities of color, and that is a focus on the ways that these forms of systemic inequality and structural inequality fuel the spread of HIV and AIDS in minority communities. So this is in part a conversation about whose art and also what kind of art gets counted as such. So whose voices, whose work, whose stories are seen as being worthy of inclusion in the venerated space of the art museum. And certainly there has been a wealth of cultural production in communities of color about AIDS that doesn't neatly fit into the art museum mold. So anything like from the work of Black recording artists like TLC, who were well known in the 90s for pinning condoms to their outfits as a statement about safer sex, to like voguing performances from ballroom culture. This is still from Jenny Livingston's 1990 documentary about the underground ballroom scene where queer and trans youth of color get together and compete in these elaborate costuming and dance competitions. And these have historically been both a source of community for queer and trans youth of color, but also sites for HIV testing, for AIDS prevention education, and for HIV treatment. So, with all this in mind, and in response to our AIDS America slide, Kia LaBeija produced a photographic work called Your White Walls Can Kiss My Black Ass, a photographic piece meant to challenge the whiteness and the maleness of both our AIDS America and of the American art scene more broadly. But ultimately, I think Art AIDS America and this activist challenge to it are about more than just the art world. The organizers of the exhibit neglected to include Black artists because it seems that many of those artists were invisible to them. According to Jonathan Katz, one of the curators for Art AIDS America, they unwittingly reproduced the biases of the art world, which is itself embedded in the racism and sexism that structure American society. But it strikes me that Art AIDS America, in this way, is very much a microcosm of the response to AIDS in the United States more broadly. Because the fight against this kind of erasure of people of color in the AIDS epidemic has been a focal point of minority AIDS activism going back to the early days of the AIDS crisis, going back to the middle 1980s, when Black and Latino activists challenged groups like Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York, the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, some of those AIDS service organizations that were among the first responders to the epidemic. But those organizations grew out of the social networks of white gay men with access to some measure of social and cultural capital. And because of their social location in those networks, they tended to unintentionally, most of the time, exclude gay and bisexual men of color, not to mention minority drug users and women, all of whom were disproportionately impacted, disproportionately affected, going back to the very beginning of the epidemic by HIV and AIDS. So I think that in this way, the controversy over Art AIDS America reflects the fight that minority AIDS activists have been waging since the very beginning of the epidemic. So when Art AIDS America moved to its second location, the Zuckerman Museum of Art at Kennesaw State University near Atlanta in February, organizers made a really deliberate effort to include more work by Black artists. This includes work by Whitfield Lovell, Bethany Joy Collins, Alvin Baltrop, Ronald Lockett, and Willie Cole. Cool. And when the exhibit moves to the Bronx Museum of the Arts next month, still more new work will be added. But regardless of what happens or how much new work is added to Art AIDS America, the exhibit has highlighted the ways that people of color have historically been erased from the AIDS epidemic in the United States, and the ways that people of color are being erased today in the ways that we tell the history of the epidemic in this country. And recognizing the role of people of color in the US AIDS epidemic is about more than just getting the story right. Because if we only recognize that people of color have been disproportionately affected by HIV and AIDS, but don't understand the ways that those communities responded to HIV and AIDS, through art as well as through activism, then those communities appear as passive and powerless victims of AIDS. And that narrative of passivity and powerlessness shifts the blame for an epidemic that is connected to virtually every form of inequality in American society back onto the communities that are most affected by it. So turning to the possible futures of AIDS activism, the title of my talk today is "The AIDS Crisis is Not Over." But we are actually living in a time when world leaders are talking about an end to AIDS. In 2014, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo,
I don't know how to.
I have no more slides anyway. So in 2014, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo rolled out a plan to end AIDS in his state by 2020. And over the last 5 years, the CDC and the UN have been talking seriously about plans to achieve what we call an AIDS-free generation. And these plans generally focus on scaling up access to HIV testing and to HIV medication, both to keep people who are living with HIV from progressing to full-blown AIDS, and to cut down on new HIV infections, because people who are living with HIV but adhering to a course of HIV treatment are much less likely to pass the virus on to others. And now, HIV medication is being used prophylactically by people who are at risk in order to prevent contraction of HIV. That method, using Truvada, the medication that was shown in that still life piece, uses a method called PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, I didn't think about the acronym, has been shown to be over 99% effective. So scaling up access to HIV medication is a really important strategy for both ending AIDS and for cutting down on new HIV infections. And I think this is one possible future for AIDS activism, this focus on dramatically increasing access to medication. And indeed, some of the AIDS activist movement's biggest successes have been in these areas of access to treatment, access to medication. And as Surviving and Thriving makes really clear, AIDS activists fought very hard to win funding for AIDS research, for clinical trials, and just to make the medical establishment recognize the authority of people with AIDS to speak about their disease. And those accomplishments are very, very important. They've been absolutely crucial to the history of HIV and AIDS in this country. But I think that a future AIDS activist movement focused mainly on these issues of access to HIV testing and medication would be a rather narrow one. Because as we think about the possible futures of AIDS activism in the United States, I think it's more instructive maybe to look at the movement's failures than its successes. Because it's the failures of the movement that show us the work that remains unfinished. And this unfinished business includes the fight for universal health care in the United States, the fight for realistic sex education in our schools, the fight for an end to the war on drugs, including an end to the ban on federal support for needle exchange programs, an end to homophobia, an end to racism, an end to sexism, to classism, to poverty, to transphobia. All issues that have been championed by AIDS activists in the United States. And each of these unfinished battles makes clear that ending AIDS is about more than just getting people on HIV treatment or promoting condom use, although those things are very, very important. But just to focus on those interventions at the individual level, on getting individuals to take HIV medication, on getting individuals to practice safer sex, misses the forest for the trees. Because AIDS is an epidemic that connects to virtually every form of inequality in our society. And any solution to the AIDS crisis, which again is not over, that leaves the war on drugs in place, that leaves the system of mass incarceration intact, that leaves millions of Americans without quality health care, or leaves our children without access to anything but abstinence-only sex education, will not truly end AIDS. Ending the AIDS crisis is not just about stopping this virus from spreading from person to person, it's about building a more just world. Thank you. And I'll be happy to take questions at this point, right? As the histories of, like institutionalized state-sanctioned white supremacy are similar. Maybe a difference to maybe some difference in degree, but similar nonetheless. And that's another country with real.
I was just going to say, no, India also, at least in terms of AIDS spread among women, gender inequalities really facilitates the spread of AIDS to women who can't say no to sex with their husbands, or who know they're at risk but will go ahead and conceive a child because otherwise they will be thrown out of the family.
Mm-hmm. In countries where girls are pulled out of school earlier, they're more likely to become HIV positive in their lifetime. There's actually like a very strong correlation between education for women and girls and them being less likely to contract HIV in their lifetimes. But yeah, in terms of parallels, the United States, I think, and South Africa are relatively similar, and there are also pretty interesting connections between US AIDS activists and South African AIDS activists. So, a number of ACT UP members went over to South Africa in the late 90s and the early 2000s to, kind of talk to people about how to do grassroots HIV education, how to do direct action around AIDS. So, we can actually track, or we're starting to track some of those connections, those transnational connections among activists in a way that is, I think, really interesting. ACT UP also, ACT UP Paris used to be a lot more active than they are, but in the late 90s and 2000s was a very active ACT UP chapter, and was organizing around issues of immigration and race in France with, like North African immigrants, and things like that. So, yeah.
First of all, I'm sorry I was late.
No worries.
I apologize if somebody asked this already, but the generation of vertical transmission people who are now old enough to be politically active, are they making a push for, especially in transition of care to adult care and for vertical transmission and children getting AIDS? Are they becoming active on that front?
You mean, so like the generation of like mother to child transmission?
Right. So those kids, those babies now are old enough to be starting to vote and make noise. Are they starting to represent that group? Are they starting to make noise about children and vertical transmission?
There are some. Kia LaBeija from the our AIDS America is one. And there are a number of others that are like pretty high profile. The landscape of American AIDS activism has really changed, right? It's not so much this like grassroots model anymore that we saw in the early 90s. It's more of the, kind of advocacy model. So, you have some people who are out there vocal on issues of AIDS and kind of aging with AIDS and mother-to-child transmission, but the reality of living with HIV has also changed so much that some of the issues have changed along with it. So, mother-to-child transmission is relatively rare now because of the medical advances that have been made to prevent that. So, that doesn't happen nearly as much. So, in one sense, it's a little bit hopeful because those children can have normal lives if they choose to have normal lives. Like there's not this sense of impending death hanging over them that was true of AIDS activists in the 80s and 90s. So long answer to a short question. Shortish. Long answer to a shortish question. There are a number of people who are AIDS advocates who were contracting HIV through mother-to-child transmission, but in this like larger changing landscape. What it means to be an AIDS activist just, kind of looks different. Yeah.
Okay. I grew up from the generation when it first came into the forefront, and I know it took a couple of very famous people contracting AIDS. They were visibly, you could tell they were sick. And this later generation of celebrities or people that are known, they don't look sick. Have you noticed it kind of changing the attitude of, say, some of the people that you're trying to educate, listening, people may not feel the need to be as active or as adamant that we need treatment, we need education, because, it's become a chronic illness, you can live with it, it's no big deal. Have you noticed a difference in attitudes?
Yeah, I think that for the generation that's kind of coming of age now, like the students that I teach, that some of you I'm sure teach as well, just have a rather different attitude about HIV and AIDS than people who are a little bit older, people who directly witnessed those early years of the epidemic. And again, in some ways, that's not a bad thing that that people aren't dying quickly and in these publicly, horrific and stigmatized ways. But I do think that, there is a little bit of a complacency, maybe, as a result. On the flip side, what's kind of interesting when you look back is that, the opening slide that I used with carrying that banner, the AIDS crisis is not over, that's from 1991. So, from very early on, there was the sense that complacency was setting in, that, people were going to stop using condoms again, that the nation was forgetting once we got, AZT, or once we got the Ryan White Care Act, that, kind of at every step of what we would think of as progress in the fight against HIV and AIDS, that there was a risk of forgetting or a risk of that kind of erasure. So, what you kind of do with that, other than to say, like, people have always been worried about this, I'm not quite sure. But the other thing that I should say here is that, with somebody like, say, Magic Johnson, who has been living with HIV for 25 years or more, people look at him, and he looks so healthy, he, I think probably is so healthy, he has access to great health care, and he was also, a very healthy guy, athletic guy before that, before he contracted HIV. So people look at him and think, either he doesn't have HIV anymore, he's been cured of HIV, there is some kind of cure available that's only available to rich people. I mean, these are serious beliefs that people hold, that actually are dangerous, because you can correlate belief in those kinds of, what we might label conspiracy thinking, that there's a cure and it's only accessible to some, or that people are sitting on it, or that only the rich have it. The belief in those kinds of stories correlate actually to people who are HIV positive not taking not adhering to medication and treatment, and that has health consequences for them and potentially for their sexual partners as well. So yeah, we can trace definite impacts from maybe the lack of visibility. So double-edged sword, probably sharper on one side than the other. Yeah.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Please do write one of your little forms. It's like 2 questions, so we'd love to have.
Thank you all for being here.
Do you need better water?
No, I'm good.
transmission.